And in the case of Zacchaeus, he didn't always need an invitation. Sometimes he'd invite himself. And we see Jesus giving and receiving hospitality with a huge variety of people. Newly converted disciples, tax collectors, people of ill repute, Pharisees, so he'd be spending time in prominent homes with society guest lists. But he was also spending time in simple family homes like Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And other times, intimate conversations, intimate meals with his disciples, with those closest to him. In fact, Jesus spends so much time doing this kind of thing, having these kinds of interactions and spending time with people in this way, that in Luke 7, verse 34, they say of him, "The Son of Man came eating and drinking." And while they say it in a negative way, because they say in the very next breath, he was a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, Jesus almost seems to own that reputation, that he came eating and drinking. And evidence suggests, as we read the Gospels, evidence suggests that, in fact, it was part of Jesus' mission strategy, the way that he did mission, the way that he spoke to people, was to spend time with people, spend real face-to-face time with people, having conversations with them, sharing a meal with them, maybe a long meal stretching into the evening. And that could be an evangelistic opportunity with the unconverted, with the unsaved. It might be a meal with his friends, with his supporters, with his disciples. It might be a very intimate conversation with a specific family or some of his disciples. So, if hospitality is so prominent in Jesus' life, and according to Romans 8, verse 29, we are predestined to be conformed to his image, is it any wonder that when we get to Romans 12:13, we're commanded to, among many other things, we are commanded to practice hospitality. Be like Jesus, practice hospitality. And it's these two words that I'd like us just to focus on for a short while this morning. And we'll do it in three sections. First of all, what do the words mean? What does it mean to practice hospitality? Secondly, how do we do it? We'll look at some Bible passages. What does it look like in practice? What kind of hospitality is it that the Bible talks about? And then thirdly, why? Why do we do it? What is our motivation for hospitality? So, first of all then, these words from Romans 12, verse 13, practice hospitality. What do the words mean? Looking first at the context from Romans 12, verses 1 and 2, we see that pretty much everything really that flows through Romans 12, something that we do in response to God's mercy, something that we do because our minds have been renewed and transformed, and we see the world differently now that we've been saved, and something that is God's good, pleasing, and perfect will for us to do. So that's the backdrop. I think something else that we see when we look at the whole of Romans 12 and the structure of the chapter, something else that becomes clear is that hospitality, giving hospitality, is a command, not a gift. Now, what do I mean by that? There's a distinction, I think, in Romans 12 between things which are gifts, which some of us are given gifts that others don't have, that we should exercise, and there are other things which we're all commanded to do. Verses 3 through 8, it talks about the body and different parts of the body having different functions and having different gifts. So it talks about prophecy, serving, teaching, encouraging, giving, leadership, showing mercy, and it speaks about those as gifts. And it says exercise those gifts in accordance with the degree of faith that you've been given. So exercise those gifts in accordance to the degree to which you've been given them. Now, we need to be a little bit careful because we can, humanly speaking, we can fall into the temptation of, well, I haven't been given the gift of teaching, so I'm never going to teach. So we need to be a little bit careful, but we have, each of us individually have been given gifts to serve the rest of the body. And we exercise those in accordance to the degree to which we've been given. But when we move to the second half of Romans 12, verse 9 onwards, now it changes. And it begins, verse 9, love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. And now we're not talking about gifts, we're talking about commands that we've all been given, all of us, regardless of how gifted we are. And so there's a list of things which flow from love. Loving devotion to one another, honouring one another above ourselves, being zealous, sharing with those in need, blessing those who persecute us, and there's a much longer list. And in the middle of that list, practice hospitality. But the main point is, it's a command, not a gift. So while some of us are called to teach, some of us are called to serve, some of us are called to lead, we're all commanded to practice hospitality, to be hospitable. It's part of normal Christian life to be hospitable and to be sharing hospitality. So, we should all be doing it. It's part of our normal Christian life. What is it? What does practice hospitality mean? Well, it's not rocket science. There's nothing complicated about the words. We can very readily understand them in English. What does practice mean? Well, of course, in English, we practice. What do we do? Why do we practice? If we want to get better at something, we practice doing it. If we want to get better at football, we practice playing football. If we want to get better at running, we practice running. Better at a language, we practice our vocabulary. We practice the language. We know what practice means. Nothing at all complicated about it. And the Greek word that's been translated, practice, again, a very, very simple word. It means exactly what we think it means. It means be doing it, be practicing it, be doing it constantly, consistently. It's got the sense of pursuing something or somebody. So if we are chasing somebody on foot, we want to catch somebody, what do? Well, we keep on chasing them. We keep on pursuing them until we have caught them. Interestingly, 30 times out of the 44 times that the word occurs in the New Testament, 30 out of the 44, the word is actually translated as persecute or oppress. Now that might seem strange, but I think when we think about it, persecution means a deliberate effort to do harm to somebody. We don't persecute somebody by ignoring them. We persecute someone by going out of our way to make their life a misery. Now, that's not what hospitality is about, is it? But the point is, it's a deliberate act. It requires effort. It's a deliberate act. It's something that we deliberately engage in and make an effort to do. And so we are deliberately pursuing hospitality, or it's translated in other places, it's translated make every effort to add to your faith. And so here the same word is used, make every effort to be hospitable. So, as we're commanded in Romans 12, this is something that, not just something that we do when we feel like it, but actually something that we make a conscious effort to be doing, to be practicing, and to be making it a habit. Something that we aim to do regularly, something that we aim to get better at, certainly, but more importantly, I think, just something that we are actually engaging in, something that we are actively doing, actively reaching out to people. So we practice, we get on with it, we do it, we pursue it. What is it that we are practicing? So hospitality, I'm not really into word studies in sermons, but the Greek word for hospitality, actually we do know the two Greek words that make up hospitality. And the word that gets translated as hospitality is philo, xenes, X-E-N-E-S, philoxenes. It's two Greek words, and we do know both of them. So philo, and we know philo because that's Philadelphia, the place, not the cream cheese, but Philadelphia, brotherly love. Philo is love, showing brotherly love, loving someone, being a friend of someone. And xenes, and we know the word xenes as well, X-E-N-E-S, because we speak about someone who is xenophobic. And they are afraid of xenes. The word xenes means stranger, someone who is afraid of strangers. So philoxenes is hospitality, is someone who loves strangers, someone who is a friend of strangers. That's what hospitality means. That's the Greek word that's translated as hospitality in the Bible. So we are commanded to practice, to put an effort into, to make every effort to be a friend of strangers, to love strangers. That probably leads us on to the question of, well, okay, I'm to love strangers. Who is a stranger? Who does that mean? And I think that's a bit like when somebody asked Jesus, who is my neighbour? And Jesus replies, doesn't he, with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I think the central meaning really of that parable, Jesus essentially reframes the question. And he's saying to the person who's asked the question, well, you've asked me, who is my neighbour? My response is, well, who isn't your neighbour? And I think it's the same with strangers. Who is a stranger? Well, who isn't a stranger? You know, a foreigner, somebody from a foreign nation, yes, they're a stranger. Somebody from outside of our town, outside of our church. But let's bring it closer to home. Is this person in your immediate family? Do they live in your home? Or are they part of your natural genetic family? Well, if they're not, then they fall into the definition of stranger, don't they? So loving strangers, essentially loving anyone, being a friend of anyone who wouldn't naturally be sharing a meal with you, doesn't sleep in your home with you. So what is hospitality? Being a friend of anyone who doesn't live in your home. Now, that's very broad and perhaps so wide that it's not particularly helpful because you might quite rightly say, well, that's not possible. How can I possibly love everyone? I can't invite everyone to my home, can I? That's nonsense. Well, yes, of course it is. We can't invite everyone. We cannot love everyone. But we must love strangers. We must be friends of strangers. So let's look at a handful of other passages in the Bible about hospitality to help us think about what that means in practice, what that means for us in real life. So, what does it look like in practice? What does hospitality look like? First of all, who should be doing it? Well, we've covered that to a great degree already, because we've said it's a command, not a gift. It's something that we should all be doing. It's part of ordinary Christian life. The New Testament, I think, confirms that elsewhere too. So it's a qualification, a prerequisite for being an elder. 1 Timothy 3, Titus 1. Now, is that because it's the job of the elders to be the ones doing the hospitality? Well, yes, elders should be hospitable, but they're not the only ones. The reason it's a qualification for an elder is because it's something that all Christians should be doing. And elders, by definition, if an elder is to lead other Christians, they must surely be demonstrating the fruits of a normal Christian life. That's why it's a prerequisite of an elder, that they are leading a Christian life. They are doing things that would be expected of Christians. And 1 Timothy 5, verses 9 and 10 also says something along the same lines, but from a very different angle. And here it's talking about widows in the church. And the context is it's talking about widows and who should be provided for by the church and who shouldn't. 1 Timothy 5, verse 9 and 10, it says, "No widow may be put on the list of widows," that is the list of widows to receive support, "unless she is over 60 and has been faithful to her husband and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds." So what do we learn here? Widows over the age of 60 must be hospitable. Yes, we do, but that's not the point. I don't think that's the point at all. What Paul is actually getting at is that he's concerned that only those in genuine need and only those who are show genuine fruit of being a Christian should be supported. And so again, we see practicing hospitality, showing hospitality is something that all of us are doing. It's a very common, ordinary Christian thing to be doing. It's a fruit that should be seen in our lives, and a way in which, one of the ways in which we might determine or think about whether somebody is truly a Christian or not. So, in terms of hospitality, what Paul is teaching us is that it's something that all Christians do. It's a fruit flowing from our being a Christian. I think we also learn something else from this passage, and that is hospitality doesn't need to be costly. It doesn't need to be expensive financially, because these widows, these women who are showing hospitality, they're on the list of people needing support. They're in real hardship and they need support from the church. And yet, despite that, they are quite able to practice hospitality, to be showing hospitality. So we learn that hospitality doesn't need to be expensive. It doesn't need to be a special meal or even any meal. Frankly, we can still be hospitable. We can still be friendly to strangers. We can still invite them around. We can still spend time with people, regardless of our material need. So which Christians are hospitable? Well, all of us. Who should we be being hospitable to? Well, as we saw, the definition of strangers. Well, in a broad sense, we should be hospitable to anyone who isn't either a false teacher or someone who's turned their back on Christ. There are those two very specific categories of person that we're told not to be hospitable to. But in all other senses, we are to be hospitable to any and everyone. But there is a distinction, I think, and an order of priority that we see as we read the various passages in Scripture. And I say that because we're commanded to be hospitable to each other. So there's a command to be hospitable within the church, with fellow believers. 1 Peter 4, verse 7 to 10, "The end of all things is near. Therefore be clear-minded and self-controlled so that you can pray. Above all, love each other deeply, because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling." So there's a clear command for us to be hospitable to one another, to be spending time with one another. And we see this too in Jesus' teaching. And this, John 13, is much wider than hospitality, but surely it includes it. "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Now that's broader, isn't it, than hospitality? But certainly I think hospitality forms part of that. How do we show love to one another? We're hospitable to one another. We spend time with one another. It's very difficult to love somebody practically if we're not spending time with each other. So we're commanded to be spending time with each other, not just at church on a Sunday, but to be spending time with each other at other times too. So be hospitable to fellow believers. We're encouraged, so perhaps not to quite the same degree, but we are encouraged to show hospitality to missionaries and to those who have dedicated their lives to serving in the ministry. And we get that from 3 John 8, where John talks about the faithfulness of the brothers who've gone out as missionaries with no help from outsiders, and talking about how they rely upon the church to support them, fellow believers to support them. And so we are strongly encouraged to support missionaries, to be hospitable to missionaries, to those in the ministry who have given their lives in the ministry. And then thirdly, we're also strongly encouraged from the way that Jesus sent out his disciples to accept hospitality from non-believers, and surely to give hospitality to non-believers as well. Luke 9, verses 1 to 6, Jesus calls the 12 together, and he gives them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases. And he sends them out into the villages, and he says to them, take nothing for the journey, no staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. So go out completely unprepared. Whatever house you enter, stay there until you leave that town. If people do not welcome you, leave their town and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. And so they go out to the villages. But notice Jesus tells the disciples, don't make preparation, don't be self-sufficient, just go. As you are, just go. And rely on other people to give you hospitality, to feed you, to look after you, to give you somewhere to sleep. A very bold thing to do, isn't it? Why would Jesus do that? Why would he send out his disciples in that way? Presumably, one of the reasons would be that it would mean that they spent time with other people. They weren't just preaching on the streets and then disappearing into their homes, but actually they were spending time in people's houses, sharing meals with them, having one-to-one, face-to-face conversations with them. So, are you being hospitable to non-believers? Are we spending time? It doesn't necessarily mean inviting them into our house every time, but are we spending time with them? Are we having face-to-face conversations with them, sharing a coffee with them, sharing a meal with them? Tim Chester recounts a friend of his, who speaks about a friend of his who had witnessed to a Marxist for 4 years before he came to faith. But eventually he did come to faith, this Marxist, and he actually told Tim Chester's friend, he said, you know, the thing that persuaded me to be a Christian or to take this seriously wasn't all the discussions and the debates and the apologetics and the argument. Actually, the thing that made me realise there's something real about this was seeing the way that you and your wife and your children related to one another. Coming into your home and just seeing how you interacted as a family, that was the thing that made me realise there's something different. And isn't that so powerful? His friend said, well, when he first came into our house, I think I can remember the kids bickering and it wasn't particularly harmonious, but something about that encounter and the way that they related to each other spoke to that man. Are we spending time with non-believers? Are we allowing them to see our lives and to see that we are different to the world around us? Now, there is an aim, isn't there, of course, to this kind of hospitality, hospitality with non-believers. It is aimed at making disciples. So it shouldn't be at the expense of fellowship with one another or at the detriment of our walk with the Lord. There are invitations like that it's not wise for us to accept. But there is a very clear encouragement and a mandate in Scripture to be spending time with non-believers. So we're commanded to be hospitable with one another. We're encouraged to be hospitable to missionaries, to those who've stepped out in faith and need our support. And we are encouraged very strongly again to be hospitable to the unbeliever, to be spending time with the unbeliever. What does hospitality look like? I think let's just look very briefly at a couple of obstacles that we can erect when we think about hospitality, because I think we can make it much more difficult than it really needs to be. And we might have a tendency to do this, a temptation to do this. We say things like, I can't cook, or it's the house is a mess, it's going to take me ages to get it ready. That's not hospitality. That's entertaining. And the Bible doesn't command us to practice entertaining, it commands us to practice hospitality. Remember, it's loving strangers, being a friend of strangers, not impressing strangers. In fact, the Bible says Mary and Martha. Martha is distracted with all the preparations. Mary is the one, she sits at Jesus' feet and listens to him and speaks with him. And Mary is the one that Jesus commends in that situation. That she's the one who's chosen what is needful for that relationship, that interaction, that conversation. That's what's important about hospitality. Not about the quality of the food or how tidy the house is, but just spending time with each other and talking to one another, getting to know one another. So, it's hospitality, not entertaining. Again, cost-wise, as we've seen already, that even a widow needing support can do it. It's not something that needs to be costly. That's a barrier that we can erect. By all means, we can bless people, but there's absolutely no need to be spending a great deal of money on it at all. Proverbs 15, verse 17, better is a dinner with vegetables where there is love than a fattened calf with hatred. Or we might say today, better beans on toast or a bourbon biscuit than with love than a fancy meal. We don't need to put on a great meal. Just spend time together. A very simple meal. It doesn't even have to involve food at all. Simple tea or a coffee. Just spending time together. Just a couple of other thoughts then before we move on to our motivation. Acts 2, verse 42 to 47. Part of that passage, Acts 2, verse 42 to 47, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They were meeting, this is the church right at the very, very beginning. They were meeting in homes as well as at the temple. Now, yes, that is a unique time in the church's development. Of course it is, but surely it also presents a picture of how we should be as a church, as a fellowship, as a body. Not that we sell everything and put it all into a communal pot, but that we look after one another, that we are spending time with one another, we understand each other's needs, and where there is a need, we're helping one another, we're loving one another in a very practical way. And we're spending time together, not just here at church on a Sunday, but during the week as well. We're in each other's homes and spending time having conversations with one another. And likewise, if we think about the one another commands in the New Testament, and there are 60 of them, but just as a sample, love one another, be devoted to one another, live in harmony with one another, build up one another, care for one another, serve one another, bear one another's burdens, teach one another, comfort one another, encourage one another, exhort one another, employ the gifts that God has given us for the benefit of one another, pray for one another, confess your faults to one another. Those commands are so much easier to follow, aren't they, if we are spending time with one another. And being hospitable, spending time with one another, that enables us to do all of those other commands, all those 60 commands. Spend time with one another. So, we've thought about what hospitality is, what it looks like, some of the practical ways of doing it and teaching from the Bible. But why? Why are we hospitable? What's our motivation for hospitality? Now, we know, certainly intellectually, we know it intellectually, that the gospel affects everything. And it is true to say I think that hospitality is not just affected by the gospel, but actually hospitality is something that's pretty close to the heart of the gospel. I don't think we can say it's certainly not the heart of the gospel, but it is very close, I think, to the heart of the gospel. Why do I say that? Well, several reasons. First of all, God is a hospitable God. It goes very close to the centre of his character and certainly to the very centre of how God relates to his people. God is hospitable. It's part of his nature, part of his character. God created the world perfectly spaced from the sun so that it's the right temperature, spinning at exactly the right speed so that it doesn't get too hot, doesn't get too cold, magnetic field to keep the harmful rays away, perfectly designed for human life, for us to live in. He created a perfect garden and he gave it to us to live in, to care for, to tend. We live on God's earth. We're all guests, all of us, every single one of us are guests in God's world. God is by nature a hospitable God. And that's just the very, very start. If we look at one example of Jesus himself being hospitable, what is it like when Jesus puts on hospitality, when Jesus is a friend of strangers? Let's think about the Last Supper. Jesus knows that these are his very last hours. What does he do? He prepares a meal for his disciples. He's got this already. He knows exactly what's coming. And yet, where's his mind? Where's his focus? What does he want to do with his last hours? He wants to spend them with his disciples. He's made prior arrangements. He tells Peter and John to follow the man with the water jar, and there's going to be a room prepared for you. He's made all these arrangements beforehand because he wants somewhere quiet and intimate to spend his last hours with his disciples. What happens at the meal? Well, early on, near the beginning of the meal, Jesus wraps a towel around his waist, pours a bowl of water, and he calls the disciples to him one by one. He calls them to him, and he washes their feet with the water, dries their feet with the towel. What a beautiful picture. What an intensely practical in the time, but also a beautiful gesture of the host serving his guests. Imagine having your feet washed by God himself. What next? All of this at the Last Supper. Jesus has made preparations for the food as well, so they have a meal together. But this isn't just any meal. And later in the evening, once they've eaten, he takes bread and wine. And he breaks the bread, doesn't he? And he tells the disciples, "This is my body, which I'm going to give for you, which is going to be broken for you." He pours the wine. "This is my blood, which is going to be poured out for you." Jesus has prepared a meal for them. But what a meal. This is the perfect host. Jesus is the perfect host who will do anything for his guests. Just the very fact of preparing a meal for them at this point in his life is touching enough. But what does it speak to us of, that meal that Jesus prepared for them? The reason that he allowed his body to be broken and his blood to be poured out, to pay for our sins, to make us right with God, so that we can be with him. Jesus died on the cross so that we can be with him. What hospitality, what love for strangers Jesus showed to us. Washing their feet is just the tiniest thing. It's incredibly touching and an incredibly important thing that Jesus did, but so tiny in comparison to what he was about to do on the cross, so that we can be with him. And there's more. Again, at the Last Supper, Jesus tells them, John 14, verse 2, "My Father's house has many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. Isn't this remarkable? As you see why hospitality is right there at the very heart of the gospel. Jesus is telling his disciples, and he's telling us, that God has a house, and it has a room set aside for each one of us. And Jesus himself is going to go and get those rooms ready for us. At the centre of the gospel is an invitation to come and be with God himself, to live in God's house with him forever. Jesus' prayer, again at the Last Supper, Jesus' prayer for all believers, John 17, verse 24. Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am. What is that if it's not hospitality? Right there at the heart of the gospel. Let's think about it briefly. I'm coming to a close now, but very briefly, let's think about this from the lens of loving strangers. Do we deserve a room in God's house? No way. We don't deserve a room in God's house. We're sinners. We've turned our back on God. We've rebelled against him. We're the kind of people you let them into the house and you're going to regret it. That's what we are like by nature. Do you think that we can turn up on the day and get a room? No, we can't do that either. It's by invitation only. So how do we get an invitation? Well, Jesus says that I am the way to the Father. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus is the only way we can get an invitation to God's house. It comes through Jesus only. He's the only way that we can get in, but it cost him everything. In order to make that way possible, for us to be reconciled to God, to be with him forever, Jesus had to give everything. He gave his life. He wants us to be with him so much that he laid down his life for us to make that possible. He gave up his rightful place in heaven so that we could be with him. He gave up that perfect fellowship with his Father so that we could be united with him and spend eternity with him. So, have you received his invitation? Revelation 3, verse 20, Jesus says, "Here I am. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me." What are you going to do about that? Jesus is knocking on the door to tell you that there's a room prepared for you. It's all ready for you. Jesus has died to open up that room to you. Are you going to accept his hospitality? Now, I know that most of the people that are in this room have accepted that invitation. And if this doesn't motivate us, what Jesus has done for us, that doesn't motivate us to hospitality with one another, I don't know what will. But God has done this for us. He's done this for us, but he's also done it for each and every one of our brothers and sisters. Each of us will have a room in God's house. Who gets what room? Who's going to be in the room next door? Well, we don't know any of that. But we know we will be in God's house forever. We will be with him forever and with one another forever. God has opened his house to us, to each of us. Let us open our houses and our hearts to one another. As Romans 15 verse 7 says, receive one another just as Christ received you, or welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you.